You have probably heard of Stalin, perhaps even Himmler, but one name rarely appears in history lessons and deserves far more attention. Lavrentiy Beria. He was responsible for massacres, persecution, and conspiracy. He was also the twisted mind behind the Soviet gulags. But in the end, when his time came, he showed not the slightest dignity in facing the death he had inflicted on so many others. Prepare to learn the story of Stalin's chief torturer. Who was Beria? Lavrentiy Beria was born on the 29th of March into a humble family. His father was a small landowner. His mother, Marta, was deeply religious. She raised her son with devotion and prayed for his soul every day. Ironic, isn't it? Because that son's soul would become one of the darkest and most burdened ever documented in the history of the Soviet Union. Beria was intelligent. That is undeniable. He studied engineering and showed technical ability from an early age. But what truly fascinated Beria was not engineering. It was power. And the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 offered an ambitious young man like him the perfect opportunity. According to historical accounts, he joined the Bolsheviks in March 1917. But there is one detail that many people do not know. In 1920, he was working for the Musavat Party, the Azerbaijani party that was, in fact, an enemy of the Bolsheviks. In other words, Beria was betting on both sides at once. Then came the part that may surprise you. When the Red Army captured Baku, Azerbaijan in April 1920, Beria should have been shot as a traitor. He had been working for the wrong side, but there was no time to arrange his execution. He was arrested, but escaped death for purely logistical reasons. It was the first of several times Beria narrowly escaped death. And instead of feeling relieved and retreating into a quiet life, he did exactly the opposite. He entered the State Security Service. By around 1922, Beria was already deputy head of the Georgian branch of the OGPU, the Soviet intelligence service of the time, and a precursor to the notorious KGB. 2 years later, in 1924, he played an active role in crushing a nationalist uprising in Georgia. The result? Up to 10,000 people were executed. 10,000. This is not a symbolic figure. It means up to 10,000 lives ended in an operation Beria led, one that propelled his reputation as a man willing to do the dirty work without hesitation. Stalin learned of it, and Stalin approved. In 1931, Beria was appointed first secretary of the Communist Party of Georgia. In 1934, he joined the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the entire Soviet Union. But this is where the most disturbing part of his rise begins. Beria did not reach the top through loyalty. He got there by eliminating anyone who could threaten him, always in ways that brought him closer to Stalin. And the greatest coup of his early career? An outrageous lie. Beria went to Stalin and claimed that he had personally foiled an assassination attempt against the dictator. Stalin, paranoid by nature, believed him. From that point on, Beria became more than a trusted ally. Stalin saw him as essential to his own survival. After that, no one could stop him. The man responsible for terror. In August 1938, Beria was appointed deputy head of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, the most feared institution in the entire Soviet Union. But Beria was not content to remain deputy. At the time, the head was Nikolai Yezhov, and the circumstances of Yezhov's removal from office are, to put it mildly, highly revealing of Beria's character. Yezhov disappeared. Historical records indicate that Beria orchestrated Yezhov's downfall and execution. Yezhov was ultimately shot on Stalin's orders at Beria's own behest. For decades, a version circulated claiming that Beria had personally strangled him. But the sources confirm that Beria engineered the process and made sure the chief was removed from the way. The result was the same. Beria took Yezhov's place at the head of the NKVD, and as soon as he did exactly what anyone in a system of terror would do. He eliminated all of Yezhov's allies within the agency, installed his own men, and consolidated absolute control over the Soviet machinery of repression. What Beria did with that power is something we need to pause for a moment to grasp. Throughout the 1930s, he oversaw a series of brutal purges that swept across the Soviet Union from end to end. Politicians, writers, scientists, peasants, anyone could be arrested, tortured, and executed. The threshold could be almost anything: a denunciation, a suspicion, a name on a list. A former prisoner captured the atmosphere of the time in a phrase that has endured. In those days, everyone lived in fear. Everyone expected that at any moment there would be a knock at the door in the middle of the night, and that it would prove fatal. Can you imagine that? Going to sleep every night without knowing whether you would wake up the next day, or whether they would knock on your door at 3 in the morning and take you away. That is what Beria represented to millions of people. He was not merely a bureaucrat of violence. He was the living symbol of terror. But Beria's most enduring and most monstrous legacy was the expansion of the gulags. They had existed before he took command, but under him, they became an industrial system of slave labor unlike anything the world had ever seen. More than 500 camps were scattered across Soviet territory. Think about that number: 500 camps. Camps in Siberia, camps in the Arctic, camps in regions where winter alone could kill. One former prisoner who survived described it this way: "The gulags existed before Beria, but he built them on an industrial scale. Human life meant nothing to him, and those who did not die from cold, hunger, or forced labor died before the firing squads." Stalin himself, once referred to Beria in these words: "My Himmler." Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, the man responsible for the deaths of 6 million Jews. That was the level of comparison Stalin made with his own man. And he knew exactly what he was saying. In Soviet military circles, a chilling euphemism emerged for being taken away by Beria. They called it having coffee with Beria. A tragic form of sarcasm, because those who had that coffee never returned. And there was another side to Beria, one that was only fully revealed after his death, and which is even more disturbing than his political crimes. But we will come to that shortly. Role in the Second World War. When the Second World War began, Beria was no longer merely the head of the secret police. He was the second most powerful man in the Soviet Union. And with that power came decisions that would forever stain the history of the conflict. In August 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a secret agreement that divided Eastern Europe between the two powers. Poland was to be invaded from both sides at once, by Germany from the west and by the Soviet Union from the east. And that is exactly what happened. In September 1939, following the German invasion, the Red Army advanced into eastern Poland. Thousands of Polish military personnel were captured, and it was here that Beria made one of the darkest proposals of the entire war. He went to Stalin with a memorandum, one so cold-blooded it chills the blood. In it, Beria proposed the execution of all Polish officers captured by the Red Army, not as prisoners of war, not as hostages, but as enemies to be eliminated. Stalin signed it. What followed became known as the Katyn Massacre, one of the greatest war crimes of the 20th century. 22,000 people were murdered. They were not only military personnel. The victims included doctors, teachers, engineers, priests, and Polish intellectuals. An entire people's elite liquidated in a single stroke. The bodies were thrown into mass graves in the Katyn forest near Smolensk, And for more than 50 years, the Soviet Union denied responsibility. They blamed the Nazis, building a curtain of lies over those graves. Only in 1990 did Russia admit Soviet responsibility for the massacre. And who signed the order? Lavrentiy Beria. But he did not stop there. Even as the Nazi threat loomed, Stalin's purges of 1937 and 1938 devastated the Red Army's officer corps. Around 30,000 officers were dismissed or subjected to repression. Some accounts also speak of 500 NKVD agents being executed. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, Nazi tanks swept across Soviet territory at devastating speed. Part of the initial disaster stemmed from the damage the purges had inflicted on the Red Army's leadership. The Soviet Union survived, and by the end of the war, the Red Army had reached Berlin. But the human cost was appalling, and part of the responsibility lay with Stalin, who had shattered his own military leadership in the years before the invasion. There is another chapter of Beria's wartime role that most people do not know. After the American bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Stalin panicked. The Soviet Union needed an atomic bomb, and it needed one quickly. Who was given the task? Beria. He oversaw the Soviet nuclear program with the same brutal efficiency he applied to everything else. And the workers in the uranium mines? Gulag prisoners. People sent to work with radioactive material, literally without adequate protection, because their lives had no value in that equation. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949. It worked. And part of the credit, or the horror for that achievement, belongs to Lavrentiy Beria. The struggle for power. March 1953. Stalin was 73, and his health was deteriorating rapidly. Inside the Kremlin, the atmosphere was one of pure tension. Everyone knew the dictator was dying, and everyone knew that whoever took his place would hold the reins of one of the world's superpowers. Beria believed it would be him, and he had every reason to think so. Over years as head of the NKVD and later as deputy prime minister, he had assembled detailed dossiers on all his rivals. Secrets, extramarital affairs, betrayals, weaknesses. He had compromising material on virtually everyone who mattered within the Soviet government. It was like holding trump cards in the game of cards. Beria believed he had the winning hand. On the 5th of March, 1953, Stalin died of a cerebral hemorrhage, or at least that was the official cause of death. Some people pointed the finger at Beria for Stalin's death, and some still do today. Accounts say Beria was present when Stalin collapsed and refused to call a doctor for hours. Others describe Beria mocking Stalin as he lay dying. Of course, none of this was ever formally proven, but it is entirely consistent with the man's character. What is certain is that, with Stalin dead, the race for power was on. Beria moved quickly. He formed an alliance with Georgy Malenkov, becoming Minister of both Internal Affairs and State Security, which gave him simultaneous control over the secret police, the regular police, and the small private army. He even began talking about reforms, softening Stalin's policies, perhaps releasing some prisoners from the gulags. Many people saw this as a genuine change of direction, but most Soviet leaders saw it for what it really was. Beria was playing political chess, trying to cast himself as the moderate reformer after decades of terror. And those leaders were afraid, deeply and legitimately afraid, because they knew Beria. They knew what he was capable of, and they knew that if he reached the top, none of them would be safe. A new leader. This was when a man most people sweaty stepped onto the stage, Nikita Khrushchev, secretary of the party's Central Committee. Khrushchev seemed less threatening than Beria, plainer, less intimidating. But that was precisely what allowed him to operate without Beria noticing. Quietly, and with an efficiency Beria might have admired had he not been the target, Khrushchev began winning allies. Malenkov, who had made a deal with Beria, was persuaded to switch sides. Red Army generals were recruited. Politburo members were brought in one by one. The trap was set. Beria had no idea what was about to happen. Before we continue, we want to make sure you are following along and enjoying the story so far. Leave a comment saying, "I want more stories." It only takes a moment, and it helps our video reach more people. Your comment may even be pinned, showing that you were here. Trial and conviction. It was June 1953, just months after Stalin's death. A meeting was called at the Kremlin. Beria entered the room as he always did, with the confidence of a man who held compromising files on everyone present. Then Khrushchev spoke. He attacked him directly, accusing Beria of being an agent of British intelligence, of being paid by foreign secret services, of never having been a true communist. Beria was completely stunned. The man who had spent decades destroying others with fabricated accusations was now sitting on the other side of the table. Then something theatrical, almost cinematic, happened. Malenkov, Beria's former ally, the man with whom he had made the deal to seize power, was seated at the head of the table. He pressed a hidden button beneath it. It was a signal. The door opened. Marshal Georgy Zhukov entered, accompanied by a group of heavily armed soldiers. Zhukov was a war hero, respected throughout the army. No one was going to question an order from him. The soldiers moved in on Beria. The man who had ordered the deaths of tens of thousands was arrested inside the Kremlin itself. Beria's personal guards were outside. If they learned what had happened, they might attempt a rescue. So, after nightfall, Beria was removed from the Kremlin as discreetly as possible. How? In the trunk of a car. The most powerful man in the Soviet Union folded into a car trunk and smuggled out of the Kremlin as though he were contraband. He was first taken to Lefortovo prison in Moscow, one of the Soviet Union's most feared prisons, through which so many of his own victims had passed. From there, he was transferred to the bunker beneath the headquarters of the Moscow military district, where he would be held in isolation while his trial was prepared. On the 23rd of December, 1953, Lavrentiy Beria was brought before a special session of the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union. There was no defense counsel and no right of appeal. The outcome was obvious before anyone had said a word. The charges were long and varied. Treason against the state, allegations that he had tried to negotiate a separate peace with Hitler during the war, terrorism in connection with the purges of 1941, and counter-revolutionary activities. All of it was heard by a court that had never had the slightest intention of being impartial. 6 other defendants were tried alongside Beria. All were sentenced to death. Beria's 6 associates were immediately dragged from the room and shot on the spot. But Lavrentiy was treated differently. The end of Beria. Beria was separated from the others. And this is where the story shifts from history to something disturbingly human. The man who had never shown a second of mercy to any of his victims, the man who signed death orders with the coldness of someone paying a utility bill, broke down. According to General Moskalenko, who oversaw the proceedings, when the death sentence was read aloud, Beria threw himself to the floor and begged for mercy on his knees. General Ivan Konev, who presided over the trial, described how Beria thrashed about the room, crying and pleading. He screamed, he wept, he fell to his knees, begging for his life with the same desperation as the countless victims he had sent to their deaths without a second thought. "Don't do this. Spare me. I can be useful. Let me prove that I can be useful." It was all in vain. The man chosen to carry out the execution was General Pavel Batitsky. 1 shot to the head. Lavrentiy Beria, aged 54, died on the 23rd of December, 1953. His body was cremated. And here is a twist that historians still debate today. Some people claim, based on accounts from those close to the proceedings, that the man tried and executed that day was not Lavrentiy Beria. He was a look-alike. According to this theory, the real Beria was executed months before the official date, during the first weeks after his arrest. The public trial in December would then have been nothing more than a staging for the historical record. Is it true? Is it a myth? It is difficult to know. Many documents related to the case remain classified in Russian archives to this day. What we do know for certain is that Lavrentiy Beria vanished from the world in 1953, and no one attended his funeral. What happened next? The revelations did not stop after the execution. In fact, they became even more disturbing. With Beria dead and the regime changing, stories began to emerge that went beyond political crimes. Beria was not merely an executioner of the state. He was a predator. Accounts from survivors and people who lived near his Moscow residence describe how he drove through the city's streets at night, selecting women and girls to approach. Some were released afterward. Others were never seen again. Beria's Moscow residence was investigated after his downfall. What investigators found was horrifying. There was evidence of a room in the basement that had served as a torture chamber. There were suspicions of an underground passage leading to burial sites. And Beria's wife's rose garden? Some accounts indicate that bodies were buried there. The bodies of young women. According to some declassified documents, the American government knew of these stories, but did not make them public during the Cold War, for reasons one can imagine. Beria was both a criminal of the state and a serial criminal. After his execution, the Soviet government went out of its way to erase Beria from the official record, a gesture that would be almost comical if it were not so revealing of the Soviet system. The government sent subscribers to the Great Soviet Encyclopedia a note asking them to remove the pages on Beria and replace them with an article on the Bering Strait. Using scissors, literally, they were instructed to cut the pages out of the book and paste the new ones in their place. It was as though Beria had never existed. But he did, and the traces he left behind, the gulags, the mass graves at Katyn, the families destroyed by the purges, could not be erased with a pair of scissors. So in the end, that was what became of the man Stalin called Himmler. Lavrentiy Beria built one of the most powerful machines of terror in history. He commanded the slave labor corps. He ordered massacres, oversaw purges, and eliminated rivals. He survived Stalin, wars, and conspiracies. In the end, he was brought down by something very simple. He made too many enemies. The difference between Beria and Stalin was not cruelty. In many respects, Beria was more sadistic than the dictator himself. The difference was that Stalin knew how to keep people frightened enough and dependent on him at the same time. Beria only knew how to do the first part. And when the balance of terror that had kept everyone paralyzed vanished with Stalin's death, all those who had remained silent out of fear finally united against him. Poetic, in a way. What did you think of this story? Do you have any questions? Or is there a particular aspect of Beria's life or Stalin's era you would like to know more about? Leave a comment below. I read them all. If the video held your attention this far, give it a like. It makes a huge difference in helping the channel grow and bring you more stories like this. Subscribe as well so you do not miss the next video. Thank you so much for your always special company. See you soon.